Welcome, everybody. And it's lovely to have back Martin Jones with us. Martin's done a few things for us, well, a couple of things for us over this last year, one for our birth journey and one for eHealth learning. And they were around the holographic breathing that he does. And he's going to be running a course for us on exploring the cranial sea, starting in on the 13th of April. These are three sessions, 2 hours each from 7 o'clock. And the dates are, as I say, the 13th of April, the 11th of May, and the 8th of June. And yes, the topic is exploring the cranial sea. Now, Martin, tell me, because I know this is a term that you came up with yourself, didn't you? This term cranial sea. What do you mean by it, and how did you come across that phrase for it, would you say?
Well, as I mentioned in our previous kind of talk, meditation, I was dying of Lyme disease, and I channeled a new breath work, which I called holographic breathing. And I was a cranial practitioner from the early 90s. And my image of the cranial fluid was, the cranial fluid, the fluid around the brain, in the ventricles, around the spinal cord. And that was kind of it.
Yeah.
But while I was doing holographic breathing, that was not my experience of it anymore. My experience was that the cranial fluid was the cranial fluid and the interstitial fluid, between the cells of the brain and through the whole central nervous system. And then my experience was that this flowed off down through the nerves. And it kept its integrity. Somehow it was keeping its integrity in the nerves, that it was staying a pure fluid. And if I tried to hold the vision of the anatomy books of just the cranial fluid, I couldn't breathe. It was complete with the holographic breathing. It was completely holding the energies and life force down. Whereas if I just held it as I was experiencing, that it was all one fluid and that it flowed out of the central nervous system, that helped me heal the Lyme disease. It worked. The spiritual energies were coming into it. It was working as a portal. It was flowing off down through the nerves. In that picture of it, in that image, my brain was able to offload the toxins from the Lyme disease, and I started getting better. And I started teaching it, and I started calling it the cranial fluid and the interstitial fluid, and it was very complicated. And I found that the cranial fluid, as it was part of a paradigm that made no sense whatsoever. How the cranial fluid moves is a theory, and it's a really stupid theory. Oh, you've gone. What's happened? Why have you gone? That was funny because
Sorry,
your background is blurred, and suddenly this white space opened, and there was somebody else coming
sorry,
through it.
there's someone at the door. I
All
do
right.
apologize.
Uh,
I mean,
but
when Martin, when you first um, learned craniosacral therapy, obviously that was described very differently, wasn't it?
it
And
was
I'm
just,
intrigued by that because I know that Sutherland used to say, perhaps towards the end of his life, that cerebral spinal fluid infused everything, and he even talked about it infusing the room, didn't he?
I don't know. I did two cranial trainings. One was more up ledger based, and the second one was Sutherland based.
Yeah.
I was taught it from the anatomy books in both courses.
Mm.
We did talk about the cranial sea, the cranial fluid energetically moving out through the body, but that isn't what I was experiencing. I wasn't experiencing the cranial fluid expanding out separately. I was feeling the cranial fluid and the interstitial fluid as
Yeah.
one fluid, very physiologically
Yeah.
true
Yeah.
anatomy.
Yeah.
And in that image, it worked.
Mm.
And when I started investigating the anatomy of it, every part of the anatomy and physiology points to the cranial fluid and the interstitial fluid being the same fluid. They're exactly the same thing. They're 99% water, 1%
Yeah.
glucose, salt, and oxygen. They have the same makeup. They're made in the same way. It's impossible for the cranial fluid to leave by the venous sinuses. If you look into it, it's just a ridiculous theory. It has to leave the central nervous system by another means than the venous blood, because the venous blood is already full up. And the only way it can leave is through the dura or out through the nerves.
Yeah.
And everywhere I worked with it and everywhere I looked at it, of the science of it, I was right. And scientists are wrong, or that old picture that has been taught for millennia, it's just
Yeah.
become habit. And for me, there, it's just wrong to call it the cranial fluid and it interfuses with everything isn't correct. And you have to look at it as correct, that it's one fluid. And I couldn't do it calling it the cranial fluid and this and that, because the cranial fluid pointed to a paradigm that was incorrect, as far as I'm concerned, was incorrect. So I called it the cranial sea. And so it's a different thing. It didn't have to pull people into their image of the cranial fluid. It's you give something a new name and people have to perceive it in a new way. So I coined lots of new names. They've got terrible imagery, and it might not be wrong, but they've got terrible imagery like the blood-brain barrier.
Yeah.
That is a visualization. That's a terrible visualization, and most people don't actually know what the blood-brain barrier is. They've just got this image of
Yeah.
it being sealed off, and that was the image. I was told several times that the cranial fluid is completely held within the dura. It does not get
Mm.
out of the dura. That is it. And I was told that, or taught that, in both cranial trainings. What Sutherland said, I don't really know. And what teachers believed themselves, I don't really know. But the anatomy came from the anatomy books, and that's what I was left with afterwards. And that is what I had to clear out of my system to stay alive. Because if I held that, it was I just could not breathe. I just could not breathe, and it was like night and day. When I had it as the cranial sea and flowing out through the dura, and that suddenly I just take these great big deep breaths. I feel all the toxins releasing from my brain. If you're going to die or stay alive, you choose the way you're going to stay alive normally. I think most people do, and I did. Then when I started teaching it, I looked into the anatomy. I thought, I'm right. Why are people teaching this really stupid thing? How is it possible for the cranial fluid to flow all the way down one side of the spine and all the way up the other side of the spine and then up to the top of the head and out? I mean, it's such a stupid
So
thing.
realistically, then, Martin, what do you think? What difference does it make, this understanding? What difference does it make to one's practice as a craniosacral therapist? Because a lot of
It
people on this course would be craniosacral therapists. What's the main difference, would you say, that it will bring to people's practice, this understanding?
Cranial fluid, if you've looked at the pictures in the anatomy books, is a visualization.
Yeah.
And it's anti-nature. As far as I'm concerned, of working with it, how I work with it, and looking at the fundamental principles of it, it's anti-nature and unhealthy to visualize it in that way, as far as I'm concerned. Now, I know people get that basic anatomy and then visualize it however they palpate it, but they still have that image and they still have, well, this is what the scientists say, so it must be right. Who am I to think it will flow differently? But it is a theory that is just become embedded and hasn't been changed, updated to a proper workable thing. And the same way the scientists didn't really discover the clitoris until I think it was 2008. They discovered, and it took an Australian woman to tell them, no, that is not what the clitoris looks like. That is not how big it is. It isn't this shriveled up little thing. It's this. That didn't get into the anatomy books until they didn't actually admit to that until about 2008. And it didn't get, my old anatomy books has got the old shriveled up clitoris, whereas the new ones, you've got a proper clitoris in them. And it's the same thing. That was suppressing women, sexuality of women. For me, it is not a mistake that the brain and the cranial sea, it is basically, it's the cranial sea. It's one fluid and it's been divided and it's been contained. And I think by people viewing it in that way, it stops their spiritual evolution. I don't think it's a mistake. And when I started looking to it, I think this isn't crazy. Why is everybody thinking it's like this? And I could just, I'm sorry, it just felt like a conspiracy thing. And maybe it not been done on purpose. But for me, holding that image stops people evolving spiritually. And if you hold it as whole, as all one fluid, and flowing out naturally with gravity and the pressure it's building, I describe the whole anatomy and the physiology, and people don't have to take it on, but it's not like I'm making the anatomy up and the physiology up. I'm taking it down to the very basic principles and showing how it works. People can decide for themselves, but there really is only one way that it can work. And that gives you an internal visualization that works. And just viewing it like that, you start going into a meditative and transcendental space. And that doesn't happen if you just view this anatomy. I mean, I hate talking about it. It makes me angry because when I look at, I'm getting angry at the minute. Like I've got to argue to.
No, I'm not defending anything. So I'm just wondering how it's different. I'm wondering how. So supposing you were to feel into your body now, and how does that feel to you? Do you feel essentially then you have a completely fluid body? Is that where there's no differentiation out between the the central column and the tissues? Where does it end? Where is the container in this model?
Well, there isn't a container. There's fine grade filters. But when I view, because people, let me just show a picture, because people think of the brain as solid, but it's not. It's 90% water, and the cranial sea is 99% water. And here between the cells is all cranial sea. This is the ventricle. In the ventricle, it's cranial sea. This is cranial sea. This the cells around the ventricles are completely porous and open, and the sea can flow back and forth between anything. But I don't feel a solid brain when I feel my brain. I just see all of this space and tentacles, and I feel this body of water like the sea, and the cells in it are like seaweed, and there's no, oh, we're going to section this off here and we're going to section off that in ways that don't exist. It is one undivided body. So when I tune into the brain on the level of the cranial sea, that is what I see, is this big body of fluid.
I mean, I suppose ultimately what we tend to do as, you know, as humans is we tend to differentiate out things, and we want to separate things and compartmentalize things.
I disagree. I disagree.
Yeah, but
I disagree. I think that's what scientists want to do, to label things.
Sure, but that's our tendency in the West.
Yeah.
And so when you look at fascia, and obviously AT still talked a lot about fascia, and he used to describe that as being essentially fluid, is what he that's how he felt it. And like it's often called like liquid crystalline, isn't it? And even amongst the people who study fascia, they'll say, well, there isn't really any differentiation out, even to the level of, say, bones. I mean, now some people will say even bones are fascia. So you could say even bones are fluid. So really, I suppose what I'm asking you, where does it end? Is everything fluid in the body, essentially? Because my feeling is it probably is.
Well, I'm talking on an anatomy and physiological level. The cranial sea is 99% water, 1% oxygen, glucose, and salt. And I'm describing where that goes.
Right.
I'm not describing it energetically, I'm describing it atomically. And that keeps its integrity within the whole central nervous system. That fluid is 99% water there. The fluids in the body aren't 99% water. So 99% water is cranial sea. And then down through the nerves, that keeps its integrity of 99% water by I describe the myelinating glial cells as capillaries. There's a cross-section of a myelinating glial cell, and I describe how it creates cranial sea within it. And these myelinating glial cells flowing down through the nerves, and they create cranial sea. They create 99% water within them, and it flows down them in capillary action. So nothing to do with energy, completely to do with anatomy. Within the central nervous system, 99% water, going down the capillaries within the nerves as rivers and creating the cranial sea. You've got the cranial sea contained within the central nervous system, and then within each nerve fiber is you've got the myelinating glial cells producing rivers where that same 99% water or cranial sea can flow out and keep its integrity within the nerves. So I'm sorry, but you've gone out of the picture. I don't know where you are anymore, John, but it flows out through the nerves. So nothing to do with energy. The cranial sea is held within the central nervous system and flows out down the capillaries in the nerves on an anatomical level. So that is where it's contained. Now it diffuses out of that via osmosis. So the water will travel through any membrane in the body via osmosis. So it travels out through the dura, it travels out through the nerves as water. But then when it gets into the environment around that, it is no longer 99% water. Like the lymph is, I think, 70% water. So I'm not talking about energies. I'm just talking about what is cranial C and what is not cranial C. Central nervous system and the myelinating capillaries hold cranial C. But that infiltrates the whole body. If you had just the central nervous system and nerves and nerve capillaries down to the, one axon nerve fiber, your body would look totally, absolutely whole, just wouldn't have eyelashes. That fills out the whole body right into the skin because the nerve fibers are so prolific through the whole body. That makes a whole structure, so that integrated real anatomy of the cranial C is created. I show there's 3 filters that create the cranial C. The choroid plexus creates the cranial C. The capillaries in the brain through the endothelial cells create cranial C, and the myelinating glial cells around the axons create the cranial C. So they're the 3 filters that create it, and that flows out through every nerve fiber, keeping its integrity as cranial C, and then it leaves that whole body via osmosis through the dura, through the nerve, and then it becomes other fluid. It becomes lymph, it becomes blood, it becomes intercellular fluid, it becomes the different fluids, which are fluid, but they're different fluids with different energies. Lymph has a different energy to cranial fluid. Blood has a different energy to that as well. Interstitial fluid within the body has a different, so it's all fluid, but those different fluids have different energies. And physiologically, I can describe how the cranial C is made, where it goes, and it changes people's internal perception of what they are, and it gives you the internal dynamics of being a spiritual being in a body.
And really looking forward to the course, Martin.
Brilliant.
I shall be there, and please do join us on the 13th, which is next week. No, when is the 13th, Martin? It's next. What day of the week are we doing it? Sorry.
We're doing it on a Sunday, so it's the 6th now. So I guess it'll be the 13th, won't it?
Yeah, next week, next Sunday. Perfect. Great, thank you.
All right, thank you.